from here we come to one major point that seems to be trivial, and it is a triviality that we actually face with this disjoining process, with the process of disembedding. Polanyi had been talking about disembedding, and this means at the same time that there had been before an embeddedness of the economy, meaning the economy, or what is called the economy, had not been a process of simple exchange, gaining or gain-oriented, but it had been a process of living together, and its very core necessarily be defined by use value, meaning by the production, of course, of commodities, of goods that had been needed and had been exchanged, but that they had been exchanged with the sole gain of improving life, improving living conditions, making things easier. Gain had been actually not an issue, not an aim in itself. We can go back and say actually that the original Christian idea had been very much as well about this, of interest being prohibited. Interest in terms of investment or using money with the aim of gaining. Now, this is a different, wide debate, but I think it is important to at least to have some memory of this. So the problem is, in a way, that we should not talk about linking economy and politics, but that we should say, originally we are actually dealing with the unity. This had been one entity, of course with different aspects of the individual act of producing something. You had to buy raw material for this. But all this had been part of a complex society. Now, I personally would disagree with the thesis in a consequent interpretation that we find a development that is justifiably taken as disembedment. I think it would be more appropriate to speak of changing the bed, meaning even now with, in the extreme case, finance capitalism, you have, of course, a society and a specific orientation of living together that is typical for the entire formation. And I think this is important to understand all these processes at the end as processes of a new form of socialization. These processes that are usually taken as individualization, as isolation of individuals, of individual acts not considering society, well-being or other aspects, are, in my interpretation, a different way of interpreting the relations between individuals, the understanding of what the aim is in terms of what happiness is. Going back then to utilitarianism. The juxtaposition of the different positions is insofar problematic that it does not consider that in any case we are confronted with interpretations of society, of social processes, by not individuals in the strict sense, but by personalities that are formed in the process of socialization. We may go back to biological processes where we have still the individual entity of animals, of whatever kind of being, adapting to changed conditions, and of course still needing to breathe, but instead of getting the oxygen out of the water, we could get it out of the air, because the entire organism changed. Of course, this is an extreme case where we actually have a change of the being from fish to whatsoever. But we see this as well with other forms of mutation, where we adapt to changed conditions without actually changing the essence of our being. Now, what I propose is to focus in this analysis on 4 main points that are characterizing the interpretation of the specific form of policy and politics that is the bed, if we want, for the economy we are talking about. In this way, we have methodologically a little bit a problem of saying, on the one hand, it is about the deletion or the depolitization of the political economy, which is of course a contradiction in itself. And at the same time, on the other hand, we have a change of what the politics is about. So the alternative is, I would say, revisiting the political economy as we have it today, and to say from there are these 4 major points that have to be redefined in our understanding of a political economy that is not simply and solely oriented on the stabilization of what we have, but that is oriented on a progressive or developmental appropriately path of economy. The economy always understood as being concerned with the production and reproduction of life of the people of a society. So these 4 issues are, or pillars are, for a future political economy: partisanship, regularity, abstraction, and conditionality. What do I mean by it? Partisanship. It had been always said again and again, and correctly in some way, that Marxist political economy or Marxist economic thinking, Marxism in general, is based, entities based on the orientation or along the interests of the working classes. Now we have already here a problem of the definition of the working class, where at some stages we had been discussing actually if the blue-collar workers are part of the working class, and then the paupers, those who are completely outside of this system of employment, of the economy, the standard economy, if they are part of the working class. But I think the discussion should really consider another aspect here, namely that partisanship is not about arguing, working, analyzing, researching in the interest of the working class, but in the interest of historical development. And this is looking back, the interest of the working class, where we have the orientation of the bourgeoisie against a feudal system, taking the proletariat on board to foster its own interests, but then leaving the working class after the victorious bourgeois revolution, leaving the working class not outside but there in the rain and working against it, meaning exploiting it. The interest of the bourgeois revolution was, of course, the interest of the bourgeoisie, but the interest of society as well as a way of socialization. Marx had been talking about it, saying, or speaking of the progressive function of the bourgeois revolution as exactly this, as means of socialization, of being progressive, a progressive economy if compared with the feudal system. Progressive meaning more productive, more efficient, making use of the means of production in a more efficient way, and making it in this way necessarily so, as well in the interest of the disadvantaged classes, because otherwise they would not have had a market to sell the products. No demand, so no supply, which means no interest of the bourgeois to produce. Now we have to think about what is today socialization about, in which way actually can it move forward, and that means as well, and not least, what are the needs and what are the needs today, the needs and wants today of human beings, of people who are freely or who are able to develop freely their own interest. This is important to say. It is still the interest of people, but now considering this in another, if you want, in a model, having the potential of the wealth that is produced available not for a small minority but for society, to think about there a new legal system as well of distributing this wealth, of course depending on the property relationships, and then moving on to say here we have a different needs. Because of course in this society that is geared to individualized socialization, we have as well needs that are characterized by this: private transport, private holidays, living in a seduced and cocooning way. There is actually a good example of this, where going back in history, we have this individualized socialization on the side of the bourgeoisie, whereas the proletariat lived under completely different circumstances. On the one hand, as reply on the problematic socio-economic situation, but at the same time it was a lifestyle, a different lifestyle. Look at the estates, the living estates, the accommodation of the proletariat. An extremely good example is the Marx estate in Vienna. Marx was actually not Karl Marx, but as far as I remember, a bishop, saying there are certain areas of life that are immediately collective, where we do not need private individual mechanisms to satisfy needs, but where the needs sometimes are actually collective needs. Childcare, education. You may find the private teacher for the bourgeoisie, but you find the teacher, the community of learning in the proletariat, which means, of course, the knowledge had been different as well. In this case, it was the education to function in the process of production, of capitalist production, but it can be and should be in the same way the orientation on reproduction and production of daily life for or in the interest of the living conditions of the working classes. Now, of the working classes I say here, but we move further and say it is not simply the working class we are looking at. So the partisanship is not geared to the working class. Just because you are a member of the working class, you are favored. But it is those who are in one way or another part of this process of socialization. And then we come to different explanations, and we find the models there, not least in the new approaches of political economy, that we are not talking about the growth of GDP, but we are talking about welfareized GDP, if you want, which entails other aspects of the social existence, which entails environmental aspects, and so on and so forth. They are immediately part of this calculation. They are not added. And this is, I think, one of the major challenges as well, that we get away from a distributive understanding of an enhanced understanding of political economy, meaning GDP plus, Stieglitz Fiducie Commission, but that we are understanding wealth in an integrated way. Which means as well, with this orientation on or changed understanding of partisanship, we are talking about as well about regularity. It is the unfolding of potentials that at some stage come to burst the system. Marx had been talking about this in the introduction to the in the introduction. I forgot the title, but talking about it as bursting the fetters. The means of production cannot develop further. We see this with all these means of digitization, where we have a huge development in terms of distribution and redistribution, but we do not have use of the productivity. Of course, there is a change of the usage as well, and in many cases it is benefiting everybody, if you want. But at the same time, if we look at the loss that is produced, then the picture looks differently. And this is something we have to keep in mind, that we are not talking simply about the goods that are then sold on the market being commodities, but we have to think as well about the bads. So how much waste do we actually produce by this way of socialization of production, by this way of throwing out a new phone every year without major changes, but with a change of attitude. We need this new model now. And of course, in some cases, you have the incompatibility. If you skip 1 and 2 new products, that's okay. At some stage, they are not compatible with the previous models. This means as well that we have to look for a different way of understanding what this abstraction means. Money, and in this way commodities, this understanding of that Marx mentioned in the first sentence of Capital, this is an abstraction. This is not wealth. But this means at the same time, and he is developing this in the other works on the fetish character of capitalism and this means that we are dealing there with a specific form of abstraction that is actually an abstraction in the understanding of alienation. Hugely important, I think, that it is not an economic, a purely economic form of the abstract, the abstractions in terms of money. But it is this form of abstraction of alienation. What we need is a different understanding, and this means of the measurement of wealth of the society is not the amount of commodities produced. And now we have a very problematic, very difficult situation, but it is the products, the change of the products, not understood as products, but as goods. And this includes not only the goods as we use them in everyday life, but it is as well the product of ourselves as individuals, as social beings. One major example is, for instance, education. We can use a language in a very basic way of skills orientation. Take a handbook of anything, you have simple instructions, and you do not have to understand what is actually going on. You just want to use something. And of course this is going on, and this is what we always will need, this simplified language, but at the same time we need as well, being developed cultural, socio-cultural beings, we need a wider understanding. In this way, for instance, the tools of translation, machine translation, are valuable for this one kind of instruction language, but they are useless when it comes to a wider understanding of understanding, of grasping, of enjoying the beautiful of nature, the beauty of nature, the beauty of movement, the beauty of being together with others. Take another example, the needs of the body in terms of calorie can be satisfied in very simple ways. But the need of personality with all its facets cannot be satisfied by any kind of meal, but it needs an entire setting. There is an illustrating example. I don't remember exactly if it had been Bolivia or another country, but it had been one of the at that time the only country where McDonald's established a restaurant, and after a while they withdrew and left the country because they said there is no point in staying here and this will not be a profitable business. There had been different reasons for it. One of the reasons had been at least that the people rejected this kind of fast food. For them, a meal had been a social event, including the preparation as a social act, including enjoying it together with others. Now we may enter a debate on the possibility of enjoying a fast food restaurant meal together. But this is not the point in detail. But talking about abstraction, it is a matter of coming together with a wider concept of what we are talking about. The understanding of social acts as being product, understanding the production, the result of production as goods, meaning what is good for the production and reproduction of daily life, and not as commodity what is good for production of gain-oriented production. Now we come to the last point in my understanding, that is conditionality. Bourgeois economics and its political economy branch are characterized by by two flaws, I think. The one is a structural individualism. It is not about orientation of individuals along their own interests, but it is the structural individualism that is grounded in and going far beyond this methodological individualism, where we have as well methodological nationalism. This methodological individualism is only one variation of it. It is the structural orientation that it is not actually an aggregative process, but it is that this of the isolation, of the attempted isolation. Reckwitz talks about singularities. This is at least one approach to come a little bit nearer to the entire understanding. The second aspect of conditionality, where I think we have a flaw of the bourgeois understanding of political economy or economics, it is the inability to resolve systemic contradictions. There's always the understanding of an equilibrium, and then we try to reach the equilibrium when there are some minor changes, but when it comes to crisis, we fail with these instruments. We can see this, and I think this would be my major conclusion. We can see this when we look at the development of crisis in long term. We have again and again a repoliticization of the economic process, of economics. Now I use the standard understanding of these terms. You have a repoliticization, we have a wider understanding, a different understanding, looking at the economy and economics as part of a societal process when it comes to crisis. Of course, the major shifts there when it comes to more Keynesian-oriented politics. Again, privatist, what is called neoliberalist orientation. But there we see already we have to be careful as well with these terms, because neoliberalism is a wide concept that shows many different facets when it comes to the implementation. So we have to look at this, and if we look at the more recent recent development, we find this with the crisis of 2000, depending which approach you take, 2006, 7, 8, the finance crisis, financial markets collapsing. You have had a new approach, a new shift of political economy, thinking there must be more. We find this as well when it comes to the orientation of the climate change now being an issue that is taken into account as part of, we have to think about environmental, so-called environmental issues when we are talking about investments, when we are talking about the results of our production. And we have this, of course, as well with the disintegration of individuals, where we see a change of social climate, if we want, and where we have to react. Of course, coming to a major difference between Marxist political economy and bourgeois political economy, I think that the major point here is really that Marxist political economy should be much more advanced in taking the development into account and in saying much earlier, or speaking much earlier about the warning signs and the potentials. And with the potentials, I'm already talking about the second aspect, that we are talking here about Marxist political economy should be more open there. Of course, bourgeois political economy is oriented on maintaining the system, making changes in the interest of maintaining the foundation. This is, of course, something of a Marxist political economy, or let's say progressive political economy. We should be aware of the need for change that is inherent in the potentials and the needs of the economic processes itself. So it is about the definition, the characterizing definition of people's and people's life, of the life of people, of the many individuals, and the life of peoples in terms of those who are gathered in nation states and states and are looking for a way forward in the interest of, and this is a major part of, global economic development.